Today I'm speaking with Erik Ronald. Erik is a resource geologist and a principal consultant with SRK, and you may know him from his Friday resource geology tips on LinkedIn. Erik and I discover a whole range of topics, obviously resource geology, and we get into all sorts of topics like classifying of resources, the regulatory regime, best practices, and we even discuss a little bit about what we can learn from where things go wrong and off the rails. We also talk about his favorite books and many other things. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Let's get into it. Hey Erik, how's it going?
Doing well. How are you today?
Yeah, very well. Still a little bit cold, but it's going well, man. I see you're wearing good colors there.
Yeah, I do what I can. The black's a little warm here in North American summer, but we do what we can. So
Nice. Yeah. I've got one of those shirts as well, but they come pre-made, and with my 6'9" frame, it just looks silly. So I bought it, but I never wear it. But not that I know.
I assumed it was just issued at birth, basically, and then you just had to wear it, basically, or chucked off to Oz.
Yeah. Look, not that I know anything about rugby anyway, as an import here, but it's.
Well, we'll make sure our conversation doesn't go that direction, because as an American, you may as well talk about cricket, because I'm completely foreign to
pretty much. So all we can do is pretend, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. But look, maybe just for listeners, because you and I have actually never physically met, I believe. So
we still have not physically met, actually.
That's right. So we're those sort of internet warriors, I guess, that every now and then have something semi-intelligent to say and. And
yeah, I'd agree with that.
I like your. I think I got hooked onto your Friday resource geology tips at some point, and obviously some of your other articles. And so we're both fairly active on LinkedIn. But as a resource geologist, I'm always interested to listen to what other people have to say. So really, kind of appreciated those.
Yeah, and we're a pretty tight and small community, as you know.
Yeah.
When you look around globally at the high quality resource geologists, that's not a big list. You know what I mean? And there are a lot of resource geologists that I work with through consulting and previously in corporate roles that everyone seems to be learning, but there's very few of those who are sort of established mentors out there.
Yeah.
And, that's one of those things that I know that I was a half a step ahead of half the population and half a step behind the rest of it. And so I thought, well, if there's a way that I can give back or, put little tidbits of knowledge, and most of them are common sense, I think, but sometimes it's nice to have a reminder. So that's kind of where that whole thing got started was, man, if I was just kicking this thing off, doing resource geology, what would it be nice to have a quick read about or be reminded of? Because I know I've been that lone person sitting in tech services, surrounded by geotechs and mets and all the other disciplines going, God, I wish I could just have someone answer my question about wireframe or the difference between simple and ordinary kriging, or all the myriad of questions that always come up.
No, that's great, and that's why I think it's so popular, right? Because people like to read those things, like to be reminded and see some of that advice coming through. But maybe before we dive into that, maybe give us a bit of background on your professional career and how you got to where you got, because you got quite a versatile sort of career. You even worked as a commercial analyst at some point. Jeez, that makes you dangerous.
I know.
So
give me chills talking about that. It's a long, winding, and possibly boring path. But I grew up in Northern California in the Sierra Mountains, and so being surrounded by Sierra Nevada batholith and areas around the Mother Lode Gold Country, hot springs in Nevada, the gold in Nevada, all that. From an early age, geology was just surrounding me. And so I always tended toward it, right? Math, science, hey, but here's my lab outside. Like, this is a blast. And I think like a lot of geologists, you always go into it going, I'm going to work outside, climb mountains, field will be my world. And as you progress, you just get locked to the computer. And that's okay. That has its advantages. But I ended up gravitating down to University of California in Santa Barbara for undergrad, partially because it is an absolutely gorgeous campus, but they had a fantastic field geology program. Wow. Some wonderful people came before me and just had a blast. And California is a great place to learn geology. Active tectonics, I think in 9 different physiographic provinces, so on and so forth. After that, spent some time in environmental, as a lot of Southern California geologists do. Not known for its mining prowess. California's always bottom 10, just difficult jurisdiction to develop in. And I found myself kind of gravitating toward mining simply because of the tangibleness of being able to go into a pit, go underground, that compared to the oil field. And I did do a stint in the oil field for sure. But a couple of years later, ended up over in Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, did my master's there. Had a fantastic project up in Alaska, ate up the scenery, ate up the mountains, ate up the geology.
Nice.
And it was right after grad school, jumped into the oil patch for a short period of time with Schlumberger, working offshore, logging while drilling, and, really got an appreciation for petrophysics, geophysics, downhole work, and what can be done when you can't see a rock because it's sitting a mile or two underneath you.
Yeah.
But learned a lot from that. And the beautiful thing about the oil field is you tend to see the technologies being developed there because of the cash, right? They've got the money, they've got the R&D. Once it gets more developed and miniaturized, it tends to sort of trickle down into the mining space. And so a lot of those skills, I thought, what am I going to learn here? But the basics of sedimentography, of stratigraphy, of all the stuff that falls into petrophysics, and reservoir geology and fluid flow just translated right over and well into economic geology. Yeah. Fast forward a few years, found myself getting lucky enough to get on with Rio Tinto. I started with Rio in the U.S. back in 2005 in their industrial minerals group. So I poked around with talc and borates. We had salt as well, played around with some soda ash. And Rio was a fantastic place to learn and to move internally. Some of the best engineers, leaders, managers, geologists, scientists, all that within Rio globally. And spent a few years in the States, about 5, and then went down to New South Wales for another 3. Ran the exploration team at North Parks for a few years, which was absolute blast. Underground copper gold, block caving. We had a fantastic land package. I'm sure they still do. And yeah, the gold potential, the porphyry, copper gold porphyry potential, so great. Yeah. When the writing was on the wall that Rio was looking to exit that asset, I followed the money and headed over to Perth into the world of iron ore. And spent, 4 or 5 years working Central Park in Perth. When I was there, my focus was really on the estimation side. I was in a very niche estimation team because we had 150 plus deposits, 15 operating mines. That number may be 15, 16 now. Amazing people, but you could really drill down into the niche. But while there, I took advantage of working with the commercial team for a while, doing some business analysts to get a better appreciation of really the business and trying to develop that business acumen side. But also, a little bit of leadership, a lot of mine geology, reconciliation, fantastic geomet team I learned a lot from, geophysics team as well. And I think, the sun was setting on my time at Rio, really, after about 12 years. And I'd always wanted to do a bit more on my own and see more rocks, I guess, is kind of what it is. And there's no better place than consulting to do that. 17, I came back to the States. I had 2 young kids at that point. I wanted them to know their grandparents. And so we moved back. Jumped in with SRK out of the Denver office, and it's been 5 years that are like dog years, and that's consulting for you, right? Like, you drink from the fire hose, but in the best possible way. Like, hours are long, and some projects are more difficult, but you get every variety: the good, the bad, the ugly, the easy, the challenging commodities that you go, let me go back to my book behind me and let's try to remember what this was again. And you learn so much, and you move on to the next project and the next project, and you get fantastic relationships with clients from all over the world that I would have never been exposed to in Rio. So, there's pluses and minuses with all that, but
never go back.
I really feel like, sorry?
Never go back, or?
It's one of those that I love what I do, and I'm actually in the process of doing it a little bit less. I'm actually just taking the summer off.
Yeah.
And, I find myself still really wanting to do geology and get out and see rocks. And, if somebody said, hey, you want to go field mapping and, we'll buy you lunch. Yeah, I'll do it in a second.
Yeah.
But, the 60-hour weeks with balancing family and other obligations, well, they're not all 60, but it can be a challenge. So I've kind of decided to take a little bit of a slowdown this summer. I'll be back in September for sure.
Yeah. But it's a trade-off, isn't it? It's the long hours are tough, but the versatility in the work, you see different stuff all of the time. Like you see different teams, different clients, and obviously different rocks,
absolutely,
different countries, different jurisdictions. Yeah, it's. I had not as extensive a pathway into consulting, I guess, but the versatility really does it for me. You get exposure to so many more things, and so many more problems. And that really helps you sort of hone your skills a little bit, and you can.
And compare that to Rio. Rio has some of the best assets in the world.
Yeah.
For good reason.
For sure.
And what you get with world class, in quotes, right? World class, tier one. We can call them different things. Is that those ore bodies tend to be rather forgiving.
Yeah.
When you are dealing with a deposit that is absolutely marginal on the economic cutoff grade, when it is make or break, depending on the quality of the geology that you put out, and your estimation on grade. And if you are off by 15%, it is not a reserve. Mm-hmm. And if you are in the right, then that thing might have a chance of going. Now, those, I think, are fun because it is challenging and the stakes really matter.
Yeah.
And, when you're working iron ore in the Pilbara, it has its own set of challenges, totally different set of challenges. But those ore bodies, they are amazing. It is. It's just different. And so understanding both, I think, is where I've been privileged enough, lucky enough, to be able to see and appreciate the both sides of this, I think.
Because I like what you said there. I mean, helping the juniors, particularly who sometimes have, these projects where you look at it, you've got to really squeeze hard. I mean, there could be something there, and it's having that experience then that you just described. You come from an exploration background, so you've gone through that pathway, and the economics side of things. You got to understand what makes something actually work economically, and then all the way to resource geology, and then even production, as you said, in mining geology. That really gives you the skills that you need to help those clients with those sort of really marginal projects. And where we are now, where there's a lot of marginal stuff coming onto the market, right? Where if you squint a little bit, then not quite sure if the good old RPEEE test is necessarily ticked in all cases. But
then that's what's our responsibility, right? As consultants, as independent people, though we are hired by our client, we tend to work for the public, right?
Yeah.
And it's all dependent if it's internal, external reporting, so on and so forth. But I'm thinking from like a 43101 JORC SEC technical report perspective. If you're signing off as a CPQP, your audience is actually public, right? Mm-hmm. It's the well-informed investors, in quotes. And though your client is paying your bills, you will most certainly have times when you don't agree. But it is up to you to have that independent view, right? To realize that, no, it's not my job as a consultant to ensure a certain number of measures or ensure a grade, or you know what I mean? Because yes, manipulation can happen, but that's when you start going down the ethics, who you work for, and at the end of the day, if your name is respected because you do a good job, whether people like it or not, they like the results or not. But if it's quality and it can hold the test of time, then you're going to be able to sleep at night, number one, which I think is very important. And people will hire you because of that. And ultimately, that's, kind of what we're after.
Is that playing with you guys? And maybe just to digress slightly based on a few things you just said there. I mean, whether it's SOK or you personally, signing off on things with this whole discussion happening at the moment around the regulatory regime, right? I mean, there have been a few LinkedIn posts last week from a few well-known characters on that sort of, and I'm sure you've seen them. Where do you see that balance going, and how worried are you as a professional in that space? Do you need to protect your own integrity? Well, you do need to protect your own integrity at all costs, obviously, but it's a bit of a push and shove game. And the same debate is happening over here with competence of regulators and ASIC and so on. What's your take on that?
It is very complex. It is not easy, and there's a reason why we haven't solved it, right? There's not a silver bullet for it. Now, there's been a lot of different discussion about, well, should the criteria go up? Should there be external peer review? Should there be other criteria? But a lot of it comes down to morality and ethics, I believe. Because I am not afraid to stand in front of a room of my peers and say, I don't have a bloody clue what I'm talking about, and I should not be the QP. That's hard for a lot of consultants to do, I think.
Yeah.
And if my experience and my knowledge or whatever does not fit for me personally to say, no, I'm not okay to sign off on that, then I have to accept that and tell the client that. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people within the mining space who say, yeah, I can sort that out. We'll get it fine. And they may be correct and they may not be correct. So yes, peer reviews can help. Yes, we're a self-regulating society, I guess.
Well, should you, do you, I mean, we are, and that's obviously why the regulators have probably started flexing their muscle a little bit further, because, you know, there's a few arguments you can make for self-regulation to be not the most efficient tool, you know, manage what we're putting out there. I'll choose my words carefully, but, you know, obviously the regulators are getting more into a space to flex their muscle and say, look, this isn't good enough. But in so doing, they might be overcorrecting as well, and that's some of the news that's come to us as well. So, I mean, there must be some...
Absolutely. If the criteria start to get too stringent, you end up with 5 QPs globally.
Yeah.
And that's not going to help anybody, right? The onus is on the company, the registrant, to make sure that they select an appropriate QP or CP. But we all know, especially if we're dealing with banking, there's not necessarily that technical advisory side who can lean in and say, that's the wrong person, right? Mm-hmm. Go with her over there. She's way better. Okay, well, that would be nice, but that doesn't always happen. So, you know, at the end of the day, from an individual professional perspective, we have our name, our brand, right? And if we decide to make poor decisions with that because we want a client's job and it goes south, we have to deal with the repercussions of that. But are there whistleblowers out there?
Yeah.
Are there incentives for whistleblowers? Are there disincentives for whistleblowers? I came across several proposals in the last few years where somebody was trying to flog some piece of land in Arizona and California, historically mined 150 years ago. Somebody drums it up, tries to raise some money, and it's obviously rubbish, right? It's obviously garbage. So I call the local registration authority in California. The U.S. doesn't have good like PGO or AusIMM type coverage quite as well. It's not as good. And so I call them up and say, hey, you know, you got a registered member, registered PG, professional geologist in your state who's obviously doing unethical things. How do I report or start the process? So at least a client could go on their website and say, is this person, you know, and they wanted my home address, they wanted my phone number, they wanted to interview me, they asked me if it was okay, we had a 3-way call. Like, absolutely not. No, you know what I mean? I'm not putting myself into that situation, so I back up. And guess what happens? That still continues out there. That proposal, that fraudulent scam continues out there. And it's like, so we have to be better about it.
We have to be better. And look, there's a bit of a problem, you know, if I say here as well, that, you know, in order to file a complaint, you need to find a time to sit there and fill out a form. And really all you want to say is, look, hey, look, can somebody have a look at this, please, right? And without having to, you know, go on the record or be that guy, or, you know, it's quite tricky. And there's also a difference between the regulatory systems in where nothing ever reaches daylight here. If something goes wrong, there's no naming and shaming. There's no big long list of things that gone wrong. And that's something that I wanted to throw your way as well, because, you know, both you and I are passionate about education. I'll come back to that in a second. But, you know, we have to learn from our mistakes. And you know, there have been a few high-profile cases in Canada, and you know, some of that is really good material for us to understand and read through. You probably you probably still wouldn't have a full view of what's gone wrong, right? Because there's a few cases that are quite public, and one that SRK has been involved with a while ago, and you can only help you can't help but think like, what really happened there? Because you only see the veneer of the stuff that went wrong, and obviously,
Absolutely.
let's all hunt the QP and line them up and shoot them. But there's always more that's going on behind the doors.
It's complicated. It's funny you mentioned that, because I picked up. I was going through my library trying to find a book to read, just home library a week ago, and I saw the old Briax book put out, and I'm not sure where it is. Fantastic, and it goes into a bit more detail about it, and it made me think, if I was in that position where somebody calls it out and says, "Wait a minute, these samples don't make sense." So being the one person in a sea of voices who are all saying, yes, go, this is the next, bonanza, everybody's making millions, it's go, 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 everybody's on board, total bandwagon. So to have the guts, to have the bravery, to have the security, to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, something doesn't smell right. That's not an easy thing to do for any human nature, any kind of thing, let alone a firm who's making money on it, a company making money on it, or a group. And so, when you do the forensics and you go back and look at these, scandalous things, who stood up, who knew but didn't say?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Some of those things, would an avenue been able to come through to be able to drop a note and say, hey, somebody look at this.
That's when it's scandalous, right? I feel if you interview people, and I've got a few other chats lined up with people who have got some similar sort of experience, and really, they're putting up numbers, maybe 1 in 400 projects that I looked at were obviously scandalous, where people were clearly, being really quite bad about how they're positioning what they had, but it's changed, right? I mean, we don't walk around the courtyard with a bag of gold dust anymore. It's always more subtle, and there's also what I'm sensing a little bit is some sort of self-justification for the way people think that is the right thing to do. It's like, all these rules, we need to find a way around them because we need to sell this project. And to a degree, I can get that point, right? Because the more we try to over-regulate stuff, I mean, a lot of these juniors, it's hard enough as it is to raise money. It's hard to stand out, and then now with all these scoping study rules and the PEA rules, that typical bridge where you really need to try to go from, some numbers to some dollars. That's really where the pinch point comes. And if you don't have the money as a junior at that point to push forward, and you still want to have that discussion, you need money to make money. So I can sort of understand why that movement is there. But, coming back on the point, it's far more regulated. And I can sort of understand why some people are trying to stretch things a little bit here. But then, your neighbor stretches and you'll stretch a little bit because he gets away with it and she gets away with it and so on. So it's...
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, sunshine is the best remedy, right? Getting the transparency, getting things out into daylight. And when we see the large technical reports that go into the detail, I mean, I'm a fan of 43101 because of the transparency. I can pick up a 43101 from, a website, from a company website, or from sidar.com or wherever. And I can get a pretty good feel about, they're really good at this, marginal at that. That seems questionable. Why would they pick that economic number? So on and so forth. I don't think the average public person could do that. Not like tooting my own horn, but you spend enough time in the industry, you see enough reports, you see enough projects, and you start to go, oh yeah, I kind of see what they're doing. They're stretching this a bit, or they're trying really hard. Does that mean it's technically flawed? No, not necessarily. Could they do better with discussing the risks and the potentials and what they did, why they did? Absolutely. But not every 43101 technical report is read and reviewed. There's a lot of horrendous ones out there. It's not a technical merit. It's a disclosure law, right? And that's what a lot of people get stuck with, is that if I say that, I found a deposit from 2 wire hangers out there doing divining rods, and I used 1 bucket because I could reach a rock from the side of my pickup truck, well, is that acceptable sampling method? Well, it doesn't matter. I disclosed that's what I did. So I met my disclosure rules. 43101, tick.
Yeah.
Did I do it right? No, absolutely not. I did it horrible. But there's no good way of really
that's
describing
that's
that,
the
right?
central theme to the discussions here in Australasia now. It's exactly that. It's a reporting code. So, and I've argued, and you've probably read some of my musings over the years as well. I've argued you can write in your JORC table one whatever you want to write, right? As long as you tick the boxes and you write some text in there, then essentially you've ticked the box. And it's interesting because we don't really see any complaints or issues where that argument is made, right? It's always about some sort of technicality or some suggested non-compliance issue, but not necessarily on the competence. We see very little probing on that issue, whereas I feel in Canada there's a little bit more on that happening, and particularly the regulators, not as much the community. I've received emails on the amount of verifications. Sampling wasn't enough, according to some sort of holy book somewhere. Where I was quite amused by the comment, but there is clearly more interest in the actual work that lies under the regulatory layer, if you like.
And that's where it should lie, right? Like the technical merit or the technical flaws in which the assumptions and the estimates and the work being done are based, right? And that's tricky because the discussion, I know, especially with JORC, has always been you can't make it prescriptive, right? You can't say you will sample or you will drop one QA/QC or a QC sample every 1 in 20 or whatever kind of prescriptive thing, and it must be a certified reference material and it must be within this, it must be with that, because it will be a matter of seconds before somebody raises their hand and says, that doesn't apply to my deposit.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's where that broad, it's up to the QP. Well, of course, it's up to the person who should be the expert. So then who decides who's an expert?
Yeah.
And then who polices the expert? And then who polices the police,
yeah.
right? And those are those $1 million, $100 million questions that are not easy, why we keep struggling. The good bit is that the conversation hasn't stopped. And I think that's the most important takeaway, is that if we get red in the face and we argue and we say the Canadians are crazy for putting out these expensive big fat documents and that have maybe marginal technical merit in some cases, or the Aussies are crazy for putting out this silly little table that can say, nope, didn't survey my holes. And you go, well what are you doing?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the discussion comes in of what is better, how do we improve it, and how do we work through it. So, if there was one all-seeing person to peer review everything, I'd be just probably more skeptical of that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, and it is so nuanced. Take the seabed minerals resource space. How many people have that background and an experience, right? And who, as I posted the other day, who guides the guides? It's a fraught conversation. But there are some things that we can learn from each other, and I do like that the discussion is definitely held at a global level now.
Agreed.
Just Mo Shrivastava's posts, this week and last, that's really living on our side, and vice versa. We're having that discussion between JORC and the regulatory regime in Canada as well. So I feel that's happening. But boy, there are a lot of stakeholders and there's a lot of talking. And if you actually look at who runs these talks, they're all volunteers, right? So, so it's all good to talk, but it's so hard to actually get from the talking to the doing. But and that's a good conversation to explore a bit further. But just coming back to the NI 43-101 report, I actually quite like it because where to go, what chapter you need to go for your controls and mineralization, right? And you have to look quite deeply into a JORC report or the public announcement ultimately. To get that detail on the controls and mineralization and the deposit type that you think it is, which is quite helpful. Through some of the report monitoring work that we did, we started recording the deposit types for every resource that's been put out, and it can be quite tricky if you're reading JORC reports, but it's really quite easy if it's an NI report. So we've certainly discussed whether that could work on decide with JORC as well to make that a bit more prescriptive, and not for the sake of the prescriptive nature of it, but just to know what just to know.
Yeah, the organization. Yeah, absolutely. It's helpful. And I mean, that's certainly the way the SEC has handled it with the SK 1300 regulations as well, is they took the Canadian template and added a few bits. For some reason they changed the chapter numbers, which drives me crazy. But beyond that, it's essentially the same. More transparency, more sunshine is better.
Yeah.
They are very focused on risk, which I really appreciate, because in the past you would read a section, how is it classified, right? So you can only imagine how many decisions are based on what is measured and indicated and when it is inferred. Big dollar decisions. And when you root down to the very, very heart of who and how did they make the decision of whether this volume fell into an inferred and went off to oblivion, or fell into measured or indicated and grew up to have a mine and financing and everything else. You read it, and in some cases it would say, oh, well, everything greater than 100 meters was this, and less than that, and that was it. And you go, wait a minute, this is geology.
Yeah.
This is Mother Nature. This is more complex than my data space. And so SEC has taken the view of QP, explain what you did.
Yeah.
And they've kicked a lot back, saying, no, that's not good enough. Really go into why you chose that. If you can do quantitative measures, that's great. If it supports it, qualitative is fine too. They're trying not to be prescriptive, but they want the conversation around risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Well, that's certainly something that's going to change in the updated JORC code as well, that whole risk component, right? It was mentioned in the previous code, but it was never really fully embraced by the competent persons, and that risk discussion is really key to what we're doing. And maybe, sorry, as you were just talking about classification, this is always a question that I like throwing out there, particularly with people who've got a lot of global experience. And it's not a trick question, but inferred, indicated, measured, right? There are words, and then there's descriptions in what that means. And then it's our interpretations of how we apply that. And, it's working fine, and it's a well-established system, but, I think I notice a few subtle differences between jurisdictions about where the boundaries lie.
Oh, goodness.
Right?
Especially inferred, yes.
Especially inferred, but also in the sort of coarser gold space, I would say between indicated and measured as well. I would say you would hardly ever find a measured gold resource, at the nuggety end of the scale on the JORC report, where I do still see quite a few NI reports with half core NQ with a 30-gram fire assay, at X spacing and a small proportion might be, but it sits in measured. And so question, do you, with the background that you have in working in Australia and there, do you see, so obviously you mentioned inferred, but, where do you see there's a bit of fuzziness?
The fuzziness goes throughout. I find it comes down to the company who is designating it. And so what I mean by that is, do you have more to gain by having measured? And if you do not, because you're a large, self-funded, big corporation, you're a BHP or a Rio, you're a Vale, the pressure to get measured, they don't care, right? So do you get reserves? That is the important thing.
Sure.
And where I worked in North Parks, we wouldn't look at measured because it was a block cave, something that had nothing to do with the geology, but was the mining method. Because caves are so unpredictable, the chance of being able to really understand where that's coming through was an absolute challenge. And so we said, well, are we ever going to be able to get down to that sort of level? No, probably not. But does it matter? Does it matter in the big picture? Stand back. Can we produce? Do we get reserves? Can we do mine planning? So on and so forth. It's good enough for an M&I category. That's for sure. In North America, I do see more groups wanting measured. I think it's a badge of honor.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though in many cases it's put on way too prematurely. Mm-hmm. The marathon is not done. They're on like 5K and here's your gold star. And no, if you're at PEA, I would be shocked if you could assume that you have a measured anything really because of just the amount of uncertainty that goes with all the other supporting aspects that fall into either RPEE or understanding your deposit or et cetera, et cetera. Now, maybe, there's always exceptions, but I would be shocked. Now, if you're producing and you've got a good reconciliation and you've got a history of production and your model is spot on and it's regularly calibrated with reconciliation, and you can prove that you're within, then I could see the QP's blood pressure going down, being like, yeah, of course it's measured. We've been there before. We've done that. Nothing's materially changing. We can continue that for a certain distance. But I did mention inferred, and I do think inferred's an interesting one because I feel across the jurisdictions, not just Australasia or North America, but everywhere, is some groups, if you can get inferred, you can start waving the resource flag, right? And some groups will really stretch. Like, do we need drilling for inferred? Like, yeah, pretty sure you need some drill. You know what I mean? Like, so like it's still a resource, guys. And I think the Aussies are better in defining in the JORC to say that, like, yes, it's a resource, and there's still, you have to meet certain criteria to be a resource. I think historically, stuff coming out of TSX, out of Canada, and the 43101 is inferred could be like, it's all that other stuff. Yay, we got an extra, million ounces in there. And people just discarded it, right? Because the economics weren't based on it. They'd even discount it. It wasn't even part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But then when the bankers come from Europe or they come from Asia or they come from somewhere else, they go, oh, we got a bunch of inferred. This is juicy. That's not the same inferred as you get in WA. That's not the same inferred as you're going to get maybe other jurisdictions.
Yeah, there is a lot of stretch in there, and there's the regulators here have picked up on that as well, because at the point where the scoping study needs to come up, there is a mix between inferred and indicated, and there are certain rules around that, how we allow that to get into the scoping study. And you see a lot of smaller companies arguing that for the inferred resources that they have, really this port is really an inferred plus, right? So it should really feature in the scoping study. So there's almost like
I love those.
Yeah, we're almost like they're playing that game. Well, and then if you're involved from a consulting level, then hey, if it needs to be more than inferred, you probably need to argue that it should be an indicated for all the right reasons. Otherwise, it isn't. So there is definitely a bit of pressure on how those inferred resources stretch. But from a consultancy perspective, I mean, there's also a risk profile that you guys have as a company, right? And that we have as a company. I mean, I'm generally speaking more relaxed with inferred than I am with indicated, because then it starts going into financial evaluations and and not just from applying the actual, the actual thresholds and variables to determine whether it is indicated or inferred, but from a risk profile, there is, and that's sort of where my question is going. As a consultancy, do you have some sort of processes in place to protect yourself? Because we've, a lot of consultants have got into troubled waters over some of the resource work that they've done, and arguably, used a classification that was a little bit too high. Do you consider most bigger brands being ultra conservative, or do you see a sort of difference between that at all, or how do you guys discuss that?
Absolutely. No, it's a fantastic question, and I do think it's really the ones who have more to gain from an increased confidence that you see them pushing that, of course, and that's whether they're trying to hunt financing or whatever. And going back to that example of BHP is not going to try to hunt the measure. They're probably, if they know they've got inferred, then they know they've got a whole long road ahead of them to do work, where a junior who may be a little more hand to mouth and really trying to bootstrap it and just struggling for financing will really try to push across that big boundary, the big boundary being that inferred into indicated, right? The way that we sort of handle it, like any group of technical people, and I'm talking about like my team within the SRK, specifically the Denver office and the geologists, is we look over each other's shoulders all the time, and in a very positive way, and we ask for that. And that process of peer review and saying, writing a message to somebody that always starts, am I crazy, but, and whatever the question is, and then you get on the phone or you sit in a room together or you go through stuff and go, this is what I'm seeing. What do you think? Another set of eyes, different perspective, somebody who's worked their whole life in gold. Come over to industrial minerals. Let me show you what I'm looking at and go why I'm, struggling in this area or why I'm not quite sure. What do you think? Okay, great. Now I'll go to somebody who's been working in copper for 100 years. I'll talk to them, or whatever it may be. And you get these different ideas and these different thoughts. But the important thing is it's not done in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
And I have the luxury of that because I'm with SRK and I've got a team. If I was independent, I was by myself, that would be a struggle.
Yeah.
And I realize in consulting, there are a lot of people who are in that boat. And that's not an easy answer to solve. But, and I think what you find is a lot of the jurisdictions and a lot of the code around CPQP is, can I stand up with my hand on my heart in the room of my peers and that whole thing? Well, if your peers are around you, we'll just ask them. You don't need to stand up in that room. You don't need to wait to get to PDAC and people start throwing tomatoes at you because they go, what are you doing?
So is there an argument then for the smaller consultancies or the one-man bands, if you like, to I don't know, force them to have that peer review before they actually put their resource out? Would there be a value add there? Because the regulator's sort of commenting that might be a focus to look at, right? The larger companies probably have all that peer review like you described. You can bring up 20 colleagues and have that discussion about something and find a good medium. And that's probably a good analogy for what your peers would probably say as well in a market. So,
absolutely. The forcing side, I think that's where it gets tricky because if I say, okay, well, I put myself in a single operator consulting type thing, and I've got one client, and my goodness, I need to make this client happy because I got a kid in university, and I got this, and I got that, and I got to pay the bills, and I'm not going to burn this bridge. Okay, so now you've already sort of biased yourself initially. So you're going to go, okay, well, I'm probably going to lean into whatever the client wants. And they say, okay, well, my regulations say that I need to mandate a peer review. Well, am I going to call the person... Or am I going to call, Erik at SRK Denver, who's probably going to tear apart your report, make it better at the end of it, and cause a lot of pain and a whole lot of extra hours, and probably make the client grumpy, but it'll make a better quality product? Or am I going to call my cousin, who I think has a geology degree, and they can maybe sign off, and we'll have a few beers, and it'll be all good, and I get that sign off. You can't regulate around that. And again, I think it always comes back to that sort of level of morality, that level of brand, and all you got in this business is your name.
Yeah.
If the company is not very scrupulous, then it's one of those that chances are the QP is going to fall into a similar boat, and it's unfortunate. Yeah. But that said, we always put a lot of focus on the negative ones. Yeah. And you'd mentioned earlier in this chat, you see about 1 in 400 projects they're scams, that are garbage, that are obvious, blatant, problems. And I would probably agree with that number. I mean, in the 5 years I've been in consulting, there's been a handful of, requests for proposals or some piece of paper, a phone call that I've had that you hang up and you're like, I got to take a shower. Like, that was just dirty. That was wrong. And like everything about that. And you try to argue and they don't listen and they walk away. And you go, oh, yeah, but that is such the exception.
Yeah.
And I find if we take a step back and we look back 20 years, we look back 40 years, where the industry was from a public reporting perspective, from an informed investor perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, how far we've come. And yeah, we're not there yet, but it is leaps and bounds and so much better. If I pick up a technical report or a mineral resource statement that's been done in the last 5-10 years or whatnot, I've got a pretty good confidence that, it may not be perfect. None of them are, I guess, perfect, but, it's going to be a heck of a lot better than if I pick something up from 92 or from 77 or, keep going back. And you go, yeah, okay. Well, there's been more and more diligence.
And the other thing is projects, I had this discussion last week when we were having a discussion on competence. I mean, projects still fail as much as planes still crash, right? And as many rules and regulations we put in place, a resource is what it is. And we could, well and truly say that an indicated resource might be quote unquote plus or minus 15 or 20%, but it's never plus, it's always minus, right? Yeah. So, sometimes you get it slightly wrong, and sometimes for some reasons beyond your control, arguably, this is the discussion, it just doesn't end up working right for a whole, and it's never just a variogram, right? Or it's never just a minimum amount of samples that you use. There's a whole raft of reasons quite a lot will have to do with the geology, but there are other issues as well. So it's not, you're quite right, and we are in a good place. And just because, some things have gone wrong, we shouldn't, line up the resource geologists and say, you've done it all wrong, everything must change. Yeah.
You can't regulate bad decisions,
yeah.
right? And that's the whole thing. And whether it's in this industry or all the other industries.
Well, there has to be some accountability at the end of the day, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you're right. I mean, our job as QP, especially on the resource geology side and the geology, is to lay the strongest foundation you possibly can. Right? And if you lay a good solid brick, concrete, structure, rebar, full on building analogy foundation, then you've done your job.
Yeah.
Now, what people decide to build on top of that foundation, the decision they make to put a 1-story or a 35-story house or 12 bathrooms in 1 bedroom, or, what I mean? These bad decisions that can come through, you can't necessarily do anything about. But what you can do is ensure that the risk associated with that foundation work, everything from the initial mapping, surface sample, all the way through the resource estimate and the economic factors put into it, is as solid and as robust as you can. Then just kind of then you slowly back away and you're like, okay, engineers, I've given you the best thing you can work with, right, within the best tolerance that we have on the data. Do your magic, right? And that's the beauty, is that the engineers can do so much.
Yeah.
But their assumptions are based on what the geologist kicks out. So if the geologist makes... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're quite right. And sorry to interrupt, but I find that prompted a thought there, because, what I struggle to explain, I guess, is that engineers probably live in a world where you follow the flow chart and you come to a decision node and you make this decision and a bridge will collapse. You make that decision and a bridge will hold up, and there's probably 20 of those nodes. And if you follow this all diligently, bridge won't collapse, people won't die. Happy days.
Yes.
Resource geologists, you get to the first decision node, and there's 8 arrows in all crazy directions, and you look at them and you think, I think this one is the right one based on my experience and some assumptions and some arm waving, and then you get to the next node and there's another 8 of those arrows, and at the end of the day you need a resource model that somehow reflects reality, right? So that's how I usually paint a picture. But the world we live in just can't capture that. Their models, they're all wrong. We've heard that a million times before. And I think the expectations from us as geologists, particularly if I tie the line back to the regulator, we do our best. That's never a good excuse, obviously, but because we're not at school anymore, because I always say, the best you do at school, here you need to perform. But, the joke still stands. If you ask 2 + 2, it is not 4, it is between 3 and 5. And the best we can do is capture that risk with words. And then, yes, that risk must be interpreted appropriately with the stakeholders downstream. So,
yes, if it can, right? And that's the tricky thing, because especially when you start going into project engineering, you're not dealing with probabilities, right? Yeah. You're dealing with a number.
Yeah.
And that is the reality, right, of it. But I do think a good resource geologist will be able to communicate where the risks lie, what are areas that contingency should probably be put in, or allotments or allocations or something should be put in because there's risk. And some of that's verbal communication of being a part of the team and working the team and staying through the project if you can. Otherwise, is getting in a paper and getting that risk really disclosed within disclosure document, right? Yeah. And it comes down to communication. Some people are better at it than others, and that's human nature. But I think as a group, as an industry, if we start moving in the direction of setting the expectations high, that the risk is really not understood, if the risk is really communicated on where the risks lie and the potential for that risk.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about probabilities down to the second decimal point, but so that if I'm the project metallurgist, or if I'm the geotech, I can now all of a sudden start to get an appreciation. Okay, well, this is what the geo said. This is what the geo saw. That's going to potentially push me into a certain direction. And I think that's a good thing. It's just more information informing the various disciplines. And I don't think you can go bad with that.
No, that's a good point, and maybe this is a good segue into education, because one thing, and again, something that we're both passionate about, but one thing that I've really struggled with coming into this space, in the resource space, we have books. I can see a couple that I recognize on the shelf there behind you, and but it's very hard to capture this best practice resource geology in a book. Like, this is how you build a
There
bridge.
is no best practice. That's always my best. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's right. So that's why we struggle. And then on top of that, we don't have examples in case of train wrecks where it's spelled out why that plane crashed, or don't do that again. We know there was something that happened with this company, and we sort of know what happened with that company. And I've got a slide from the Rubicon, geology that I use to sort of talk about domaining and why that's important.
Yeah.
But it is so difficult to put your finger on examples to tell young people or new people in a resource, don't do this, do that. You're in the dark, you don't know where you're going. You're trying to, here's a book, okay, this is what I must do, but it's not a recipe, as everybody says.
Yeah.
Then we also appreciate how important domaining is. I've got a couple of words out on the importance of domaining, but where's the book on domaining? Where's that on the shelf? Who teaches you domaining? And any course that you've done by any of the big consultants out there, it's all about, data, and then there is, the kriging, and there is the compositing, and there's this and that. And there's a slide on domaining with a couple of, basic images, and that's it.
Yeah, get it right.
Yeah,
that's usually the summary.
Don't get it wrong. And there is, there's a classic image in the old, what is it, the mine book, or the handbook of mining engineering, with some vertical drill holes with two different interpretations of it, and that sort of paints the picture, and then off you go. So I'll turn it into a question, because to me that describes the entire difficulty that we have as an industry to showcase what is good practice, to not be too precious about bad practice, and just just analyze it. And I'm a little bit on a quest to find those cases and to connect with people. So anybody listening, and even if you've got some interesting thoughts there, maybe now or later, I'd love to, share some of that material, because I think that's where the key lies, and it might be a segue into the education that I know with mining geology HQ, and
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, no one's going to pay me to do a post-mortem, is what it comes down to, right? Okay, this company went under, investors lost their money, there were lawsuits, there was bankruptcy, there was this, that, and the other. Hey, let's go spend a bunch of money to hire some consultants to figure out what happened, so the industry can become better about it. Man, that would be a great world to live in.
Yeah.
I mentioned Rubicon. I was talking about the Briax book I was reading. There's a few case studies out there that I encourage anybody who's a geologist, exploration, resource, or otherwise, to have a read through these. Learn from past mistakes. Yeah. If everything in your career goes well, you're never going to learn anything, because everything you do is good. When you fail, that's when you learn something. And it's a lot better when you can learn from other people's failures to minimize or maybe reduce your own, because it will happen at some point. So you touched on education. And, I look at a fantastic undergrad, 4 years of undergrad, a lot of time in the field. Was wonderful foundation for geology. I get to Colorado School of Mines. It was engineering geology, did mine engineering, everything from tunneling, rock mechanics, blah, blah, blah. I get out, resource geologist wasn't in my vocabulary. It wasn't until I started working and I went, wait a minute, it's 40 degrees out, and that guy's sitting inside, pushing his mouse around in the air con, drinking some tea, and I'm huffing it out on the rig and sweating with the flies. How do I get that role, right? And so you kind of fall into it. I think a lot of people fall into it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so you go, hey, how do I become this? What is it? How do I become it? Who do I learn from? Crickets.
Yes.
Well, who's teaching that? Yeah. It's not being taught in university, not formally. And so you better be lucky to have a mentor. You better seek one out. You better go to conferences. You better read everything you can get your hands on.
Yeah.
And, it comes down to networking and relationships, or if you're fortunate enough to fall within a very qualified team. I mean, I look at my days, how fortunate I was with Rio and the support I have. I got a lot of people work at Newmont and the fantastic team around that, and those folks are doing it right. There's a lot of other companies that they're being taught really poorly, and it shows. And I come in and audit them, or I work with them. God.
So how do we get out of that then? So because again, you know, I'm working on some things here, and hopefully I can share a bit of that soon. And still early days, but you know, I know you've got Mining Geology HQ, and you know, you're passionate about education. Who can lead? Is it our institutes? Is it like the AusMM, for instance, has a course now on public reporting and is starting to put out some more technical courses? You know, is that something that you applaud, or who should pick up that?
I think the professional side societies are good places for that to start. I think universities' incentives are aligned elsewhere. I think they could do a better job, that's for sure. You know, I did a graduate certificate in geostatistics, right? And so if you can narrow down into a niche like that, but for resource geology, for modeling, for domaining, I think that would be fantastic. But who's your teacher? Yeah. Who's the mentor who's coming in through this, right? Because there are a lot of good ones out there, and there's a lot of marginal ones out there. And the last thing we need happens to be the one person who had enough free time and was willing to raise their hand to volunteer, and now all of a sudden they become the guru. Yeah. Well, maybe that's not a great thing. I don't know. Depends on the individual. Yeah. I do think, you know, I love what AusIMM is doing with some of the certificates, with understanding public reporting. I think that's a great step in the right direction. Resource geology is not just public reporting, though, right? And as you know, to be a good resource geologist, you sort of have to be a good mine geologist. You sort of have to be a good exploration geologist. You sort of have to even wear a mine engineer hat, maybe an economist hat, and a Met hat, and a da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And or at least work within a good team and know enough to be dangerous about all those disciplines. So some of it just comes down to years, experience, the right years of experience, because I've known plenty of people who've spent 20 years at a company where they got 1 year of experience and times it 20 times over. But, you know, consulting has been a fantastic learning experience. I'm not saying it's right for everybody, but getting out there and doing that is a great way. But I would like to think there's something more formal, something more consistent that could be put out there. And then I think when you start to apply things like industry best practice or industry good practice, I think is a better term. Now all of a sudden it can be more consistent. And I think that's the consistency is really what we've struggled with as an industry.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. No, look, that's a good point. And have you, for any of the sort of younger crowd listening in, any books that you would suggest people pick up to start? Or
I like Clayton Deutsch's book. Obviously, Clayton is a geostatistician, fantastic one at that. If you're on the estimation side, it's a fantastic book. You know, there are a few others that are out there. Murat Abzalov's book, Springer Press, I think it's Applied Resource Geology, is probably behind me back there. He took a somewhat different approach where he goes through a lot more examples. And I think that's really kind of the shortcut, right? Instead of working on these projects and having the pressure of being able to produce these products, but to read about how they were done and not just the end, right? Punchline, resource reserves, great, that's fine. How the heck did you get there?
Yeah.
What did you do? Innovative or not? Yeah. Right or wrong? What did you do? But beyond that, there's not a whole lot out there. I wish there was, you know, and that's something that I've always seen as something I would love to be able to step into. It's not going to be just me, obviously. It's going to be a whole group or a team of people to be able to provide that sort of giving back to the industry, whether that's formal short courses, formal university, whether it's, you know, or AusIMM type of courses of just, let's talk about domaining. Let's give it justice. Let's spend all day. Let's have a lot of coffee and let's talk about domaining, and we'll just beat this dead horse, but we can get the criticality of it through to, I guess, the next generation or the current practicing generation or whatever it may be. And then from there, you know, the importance of fundamental data, the quality control and the survey on holes and, you know, all those other things. You know, if you're not getting it at your job or you're not able to because you don't have that network peer group or you're kind of the one person pushing the leapfrog mouse around, you have to reach out, you know, and I think LinkedIn is a fantastic way of doing that because it's so easy.
Well, one thing I find
for
is
people
that,
just to say hi.
yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, I've been one of the early adopters in LinkedIn, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 years ago even, and I found it amazing how quickly people are just willing to share their knowledge. And that's something that I really can't tell, industry entrants often enough. Reach out. A lot of these people are quite happy to share their knowledge. I always use sampling as a space where, you want to ask somebody a question, but you don't know them. But there's a forum or the discussion group on sampling that Mark Murphy runs, I think, and people, post something in there and you'll get an answer, and quite an extensive one from an absolute top-level expert. And there's definitely utility to that. And then the resource, there is a resource group on that as well. But just coming back to the books, because Clayton's book, it's a great summary, but for an entrant, probably. I had a discussion the other day with Jeff Lyman on sampling, and the link, I'll put a link in the description here if people haven't seen that one. But we talk about the mathematical background for geologists, because in order to really fully step through the sampling theory, you need to understand your maths, and he's got a very strong mathematical background that he brings to that. And it's a little bit the same here, right? Because in these courses we talk about, kriging, and then we flash the kriging matrix on the board very briefly, and we say something with Lagrange, something optimizer, moving on, because this is all too difficult for us, right? And that's how we really treat it. And what I like about, and if you look at Clayton's book, it's all in there, but you have to step through it, and you probably have to make a pot of coffee if maths wasn't your strongest suit. But if you're familiar with Jackie Coombs' books, they really break it down in language that the dumbass geologists like me can understand, right? She even actually writes out the formulas in words rather than to use all the symbols, which I really appreciate.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And Jackie's a fantastic communicator, be able to take a complicated subject and turn it into something that is digestible. Yeah. And, I work with a lot of geostatisticians. I love them all to death, but most of them are hardwired mathematicians. And that has a great time and purpose. And often communicating complexity is a struggling point. Not always, but as often is. And if you're communicating in formulas, you've lost 80% of your audience. If you communicate in outcomes and what this means, now you start to engage. And I think that's important. Folks like John Van and Jackie Coombs and maybe Harry Parker to some extent. And, there's probably Steve Hunt. I could throw out a few others around the world who have the ability, they got enough degrees on the wall. Yeah. They understand it. And they have the ability to connect as a human to somebody to say, okay, you're 22, you're sitting on a rig, you're in the middle of, Northern Territories, you're not sure what's going on. This is why all that theory is there. And those are hard people to find, but those are the people us as an industry really need to put up on the pedestal and say, you need to go write a book. You know what I mean? You need to go write a short course, or you need to pull this stuff together. And it's not always going to come down to an individual, but I think there's opportunity there, but it has to be delivered well. Yeah. It can't be delivered and make everybody's eyes glass over. And like you said, if you need a pot of coffee to digest the first chapter, you probably should close it and find something
else. I'll link a few books in the description here, and I'm also talking with Jackie in another talk, so I'll link that talk here as well. We probably, good. We're covering other subjects rather than the resource space, but you're right. I mean, it's that's what it's about. And maybe as a final question, coming back to the geostatisticians and the formulas, again, if you've read the post by Mo this week, length times grade, yes or no? Should we be allowed as geologists and resource geologists to announce to our investors our high grade gold intercepts with grade times length, if indeed we include all the background information in it as well? Because that's right now a pretty hot debate, and I can tell you my opinion, but if
there's not much else in this world that will get an explorationist's heart pumping than reading a press release with a beautiful, X number of meters at X grade, and and they will take it and they will run around and wave that around. Now, in some cases, if you've drilled right down your own ore body, and you knew that that's what you were getting, and you did it so you could get, angled it correctly so you could get 50 meters or 100 or whatever it may be, that becomes rather obvious pretty quick.
Yeah.
Should they be allowed? I think so. I think, again, the more, the freedom of speech argument, right? Get it all out there. And often the court of public opinion and the experts will come in and say, that's BS. Yeah. Well, that looks good. Hey, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And a good QP who put it out would say, yeah, we don't know any of this, but we're encouraged, and this is what it means.
Well, this is the risk, obviously, because a good QP will, and they will put an image in there with a section showing how the mineralization was actually intersected, yes, to not, and presented in a transparent way with also the information, yeah, of grade itself and the thickness itself, so that you're not misleading people, right? So. But I think, the baby's thrown out with the bathwater, because, the regulators are probably, and I'm hypothesizing here because I know the company that's involved here, but if that person does it, the next person might do it as well, and they might not do it as well, and then all bets are off, and people, and I can sort of see some value in that argument, but in this case it was done really well. And it has a purpose, right? Because we need to connect. We need to connect with these investors, and in that gold space particularly. I mean, that's how we actually put OPEC's top 5 drilling, yeah, results out every week, because we convert everything to gold equivalent, and then it's the only way for people to compare. It's a natural, absolutely, instinctive reaction, and as long as you put the information in there. So yeah, I was quite appalled reading that and seeing the reaction, but. Yeah, I was interested to hear other people's thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, fundraising is inherent to mining as, picks and shovels, basically. And if you're going to raise funds and you're going to get the public sentiment behind you, there has to be an aspect of promotion. Yeah. Promotion as a 4-letter word, and promotion as an actual promoting, right? And you're going to see all of it, and that's always going to be the case. But the reality is companies need to raise money to develop these projects. And the only way, well, not only way, but a good way to do it is to show positive results, to show things moving forward. Now, when you get that one result that comes out and this fantastic thing, and then you never hear from them again, yeah, you know what's going on. But again, I think that onus does have to come back to that QP and the company, and probably to the regulators at some point, of saying, what is okay? Was there a sufficient or an adequate amount of risk that was discussed with this? If you got one hole out in a paddock somewhere and that's it, well, it's not the next Olympic Dam. I'm sorry, yeah, right? Be reasonable.
One drill hole doesn't make a mine. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. But I don't think you can take that away from the fundraising aspect, because bankers want results. Financiers want results. Mm-hmm. If I'm putting my retirement savings into a project, I want to see those results. I want to know that there's opportunity and potential there. But I want to know that they're being reasonable, being transparent about it, yeah, and you're getting a non-biased, or maybe a both sides of the equation discussion within these, right? And that's always important to me. Yeah. When it's all roses, well, it's probably not real.
Well, that's maybe good words to finish off on, Erik. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you very much.
Got any final words of wisdom for us? And
no, I love what you're doing. I'd say keep it up. I'd love to see more people across the industry being outspoken, taking the amount of volunteer work that you're doing, really trying to give back to the industry in any way they can, whether that's formally through professional society, doing something on LinkedIn, webinars, podcasts, whatever it may be. Yeah. The more we communicate, the more we're connected, the more we talk to each other, the better the industry becomes.
No, spot on. No, thanks so much for connecting with us, and hope to one day have a beer with you wherever it may be.
Eventually, absolutely.
Fantastic. All right, all the best.